Hey, this is Corey Glenn, and I'm going to show in this video my technique for taking an open tray implant impression for a full arch. Now, there's some advantages to this technique that I think really enhance the accuracy of this overall process, and it also saves you a few appointments. It's going to really expedite that process. And so obviously I'm working on models here just for sake of ease, but we're going to pretend that this patient has an existing upper dentition and then that the lower has had implants placed. In this case, there's been 4 implants placed between the foramina. The distal ones are disto-angulated, but we've used angled multi-unit abutments to upright them. So as you can see, most of these implants are relatively parallel, and what we need to do now is begin the restorative process. Now, the restorative process always begins with a really accurate impression. And so if you're familiar with how these usually work, typically what you would do is to just go ahead and take an open tray impression. You would screw on impression transfers, take your impression, send that to the lab, and then what the lab would send you would be a verification jig. Now, that used to always just eat me up because that's, to me, it seemed like a wasted appointment. It's something that we can do on the front end and guarantee the accuracy of that impression so that we skip the verification jig appointment and just go straight to try-ins. And so that's what I'm going to be showing here. Now, the start of this process, you need to obviously place your multi-unit abutments. Okay, so the multi-unit abutments have a number of advantages in that they help you angle correct. They allow you to overcome the divergent angles like are common to see in all-on-4 type restorations and things like that. So it allows us to overcome that. It also allows us to raise the restorative platform up to the level of the tissue so that the restorative components are easier to seat and to index and all of that. And then finally, it also raises the restorative platform away from the bone level so that you're not going on and off with these components a million times throughout this restorative process. The farther away you can put that restorative interface from the bone level, then the better chance you have at maintaining your crestal bone. And so what you're seeing right now is that I'm putting on impression transfers. These are multi-unit impression transfers, so a little bit different from an implant level impression. But what you'll do with these is use the long screw, okay? That's going to stick up and out of the impression so that it's easier to unscrew this. Again, it is an open tray impression. That's what I would recommend. So I'm just screwing these on by hand initially, and then we'll come back and tighten that up with a screwdriver. Okay, so I have my transfers on, and I'm just going to finger tighten these. No need to use a torque wrench or anything. You just want these nice and snug, 2-finger tight. Okay, and again, the normal process would be to now modify your tray so that these stick out of it and just take an impression. But since we want to avoid doing that verification jig step, what we're going to do at this point is fabricate a verification jig right now, and that's going to get picked up inside of our master impression, so we'll have already accomplished that step and the master impression all in one. Now, the way that some people show doing a verified impression is that they'll take a piece of floss, a big long string, and maybe tie to one end, and then they'll weave back and forth in between these impression transfers, and they create more or less what's known as a floss web. And then onto that web, you can now take flowable composite or pattern resin, something like that, and you can salt and pepper it onto that floss web, essentially creating an intraorally fabricated verification jig. That works great. The only problem with it is it does use a lot of material, and it's slow because you're using so much material. And then secondarily, because there is so much material, there's inevitably going to be enough shrinkage between this that once you fabricate it intraorally, you're going to have to really let that set up rigidly and then come back and section very thinly between each of these cylinders, okay, to release any contraction shrinkage that's happened, and then go back and re-lute the crack that was between those. Okay, so that does work, and I've done many cases that way, and that's all fine and good, but I think there's a better way to do that. And one of the ways to do that is to use something really rigid between your impression transfers. Okay, so what you're seeing right here is a little section of stainless steel, and I use these to bridge between these, and then I only use the resin to lock this to the cylinders. And I do them one at a time because that enables the contraction shrinkage to happen on the one side, so that then when you lock the other one on, everything has already been passivated and you're not going to have to worry about shrinkage. Okay, so where do you get these little objects? This is actually just the shank of a lab handpiece burr. So we all use like Robinson bristle brushes and things like that, and you burn through those things pretty quickly, and now they're useless. I save these and I keep them around so that I can cut them into sections for this purpose exactly. And so all you got to do is get a pair of pliers, snap that off, and this is incredibly rigid, okay, very, very rigid. And those are going to be an ideal solution for spanning between these. You can also use these in reinforcing temporary restorations, things like an all-on-4 temp. These can be great. Trough out a little hole and then salt and pepper this to the internal of it. You'll be amazed at how much strength it adds. Okay, so we're going to use this to span the gap between our open tray impression cylinders. And one thing you'll notice, if you look at the new one I just made and this one is much more rough. I want this resin to really stick very good to the piece of metal. And so what I do is I use a burr. In this case, the one I like to use is this burr. This is my favorite burr in the whole world. This is called a hedgehog burr. It's made by Parkel, and it's got all of these little metal spikes. It's incredibly aggressive, and man, drilling on stone or soft reline materials or really anything, this makes quick work of it. It cuts cleanly, but it's incredibly aggressive. And so what I do is I take my little spans of the metal, and I actually usually do this while it's still on the Robinson bristle head, and I just take this burr spinning in a lab handpiece and I just run it up and down the side of this. I'm just trying to get it rough. You could also use a diamond in your high-speed handpiece. That works as well, but the idea is just make this rough. And now what I'm going to use for luting this is called Primo Pattern. Okay, Primo Pattern is a resin that is light cured. Okay, so it's going to be quicker to use than a auto cure pattern resin, but the big reason why I use this is not just the speed that light cure gives me, but also the fact that this has a much lower shrinkage factor than most of the other materials we have available to us. Okay, so this is a very low shrinkage material, and if you do this like I'm going to recommend, there's absolutely no reason why you would have to go back and section this for any reason whatsoever. Okay, so we've got this. Now we're going to fabricate the verification jig, and again, pretend this is in the mouth. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flow on some Primo Pattern, and I go all the way around this because I want to lock this in. There's grooves on this impression transfer, and that's what's going to lock this into place. And now I'm going to take a little bit on my metal bar, and I'll try to use some pliers here so that you can see this a bit easier. One side at a time. That's important, okay? Because remember, the idea here is that we're going to just tack one side, let whatever shrinkage is going to happen, and then we'll come back and we'll do the other side. Okay, so I'm just holding this in place. Okay. So with that tacked, I'm going to come back and add some more material. Okay, we have that one side tacked, and now we know this is passive because it's not even been attached on the other side yet. So any shrinkage contraction that might have happened in this side has happened. In effect, it's the same thing that would have been accomplished had you done a big pattern resin and then sectioned it, okay, because this is not connected. So very passive, and now we can come and add more material to the other side and we can lute this into place. I've clearly had too much coffee today because my hands are super shaky. All right, now both sides are tacked, so those two are locked into place. I'm gonna grab yet another section and we'll size this up, just trim it to fit the gap, and that looks like that is the appropriate fit. Okay, so I'm obviously working here without an assistant, so I'm gonna use gravity to help me. You're gonna have to do this with the help of an assistant. Remember, the idea is to do one side at a time. It's tempting to want to go and just drop this thing on both sides in a puddle of resin and then cure away, but if you do that, now you've lost the benefits of getting this as passive as it can possibly be. That side is now done. So same as last time, we're going to come back now and everything is passive. Whatever shrinkage is going to happen has happened. And now we can tack the other side into place. All right, you get the idea. These are rigidly fixated. I'm going to do the other side. I'll speed this up in the video for sake of time. Okay, that completes making the intraoral verification jig. Now this is a far superior option to just a straight open tray impression. So, you know, think about this. When you're getting a verification jig back from your lab, that doesn't really tell you anything other than if it doesn't fit that your master model is incorrect, okay? And then you got to start all over. With this, it's been verified at this stage. So when the lab pours this up, that ensures that the master model is going to be accurate. Okay, so this is the ultimate test of passivity, is in the mouth. And if it's passive in the mouth, then the resulting impression should be passive as well. So now it's ready to go ahead and do the master impression. One additional benefit to doing this is a lot of times if you make that floss frame, you end up with a really big and bulky thing with all of this area on the tissue filled up. With this, we've got lots and lots of room because of the thinness of these stainless steel metal sections. There's lots of room for impression material to flow in and around those to capture the tissue really nicely. And so I think you end up with a better impression as well. All right, so now we're ready to do the verified master impression. And so what we're going to do is use a medium body, use whatever you like. I'm going to use some medium body material, and I will start by squirting up in between all the implants. Again, if you were doing this in the mouth, you would probably use maybe some light body right on the implants to capture the greatest detail. And then heavy body for your tray material, or maybe even putty. Putty works nicely here as well. But the beauty of working on models is it doesn't really matter. It's just for demonstration purposes here. Now we fill up our tray. There is a, I forget right now the name of the tray. I think it's Mirror Tray, but don't hold me to that. It's a tray that the top of it is just like a clear stretchy plastic, and so when you seat this, it allows your screws to punch through the clear plastic, which is right here, and it keeps all of that excess impression material within the impression tray, allowing only your screws to poke up through there. So that's a nice option as well, but old school just like this works as well. As this sets up, you'll want to go and find your screw holes again, just so that you don't have difficulty getting back into them. Just a finger wiping that off should be sufficient. There I see my 4 screw holes, so now we let this set up. Okay, so the impression material has set up, so now we're ready to remove this. You know, use an explorer to get any little bits of impression material out of your screw holes. And then you can remove your final open tray verified impression. And now this is something that is going to allow you to completely skip the appointment for verification jigs, again, because it's already verified. I mean, that's essentially what we've accomplished here by doing the impression this way. So far more accurate, less chance for screwing things up. But we're going to take this a step further. You know, let's assume that verification jig went good. Okay, here's your master impression. We'll set that aside. The lab will pour that up. So when the lab pours that up, you know, the next step would be that they would make a rim and they would send that to you to capture vertical dimension, right? Because this is just like making dentures. They're just dentures that screw in, and it can be incredibly time consuming to do that. So one step that I've found expedites that part as well, and you can do it on the same day as your master impression, is to use a duplicate denture to go ahead and capture vertical dimension on this first appointment. Okay, so hopefully you're not winging this. Hopefully at some point along the way for this edentulous arch, you either had like a fixed temp or you've got at least a removable temp. You can duplicate that. So you can either cone beam scan it and duplicate it in Blue Sky, or you can scan it with an optical scanner and duplicate it and then 3D print a new one. Or if you're going old school, just use a clamshell impression like the Lang denture duplicator, or even a little clamshell appliance box, and duplicate it with alginate. I've got a video on my YouTube channel of that from way back. But the point is, you would get a duplicate of their existing denture, and we're assuming that that denture is in the right VDO, right? So it's going to capture the VDO at the right dimension. And so what we need to do is capture a bite to do this. Now, in order to do that, what I'll use is some Teflon tape laid over this, because I don't want any bite registration materials going down in my screw access holes. That would be an absolute mess, one that we don't want to have to deal with. And so I just lay some Teflon tape over this. And now I'm going to use some bite registration paste to reline the internal of this denture. Okay? Oops. Here we go. So bite registration paste does not take much. And now we would put it in the patient's mouth. The holes just ensure that there's nothing going to bind up. And then we would have the patient bite down into full VDO. Okay, so you got Teflon tape preventing here any of that impression material from getting on the internal of your multi-unit abutments. You're capturing the VDO, and what they'll be able to do is now to the lab you would need to send a model of their upper. So in this case we'd take an alginate here, or PVS, whatever you want to use, send that to the lab. Then we would have the master impression, which is going to the lab. Okay, so they're going to pour this up. It's a verified master impression. The last piece that they're going to need to mount this up and actually be able to send you back a try-in is this. So we're going to send this duplicated denture, which has been relined on the internal of it, to the lab, and that's going to enable the lab. And I actually I forgot to do one thing here. I should have done this as well, which is to capture a bite relationship. Doesn't have to be a lot. Squish that down. And I should have done that at the same time, but nonetheless, here we go. So we'll send the model of their upper that we've done, and then what they'll be able to do is when they pour up that master model of the lower already verified, they'll be able to take that model and stick it into this lower and then index it via the bites against the upper. So that lets them get everything they could possibly need to get in this first restorative appointment. You could even go a step further and go ahead and do a face bow of that upper. I like to use this. This is the Kois Dentofacial Analyzer, and this is a really, really useful tool. Basically, you would align the horizontal portion to their interpupillary line. The back portion gets parallel to allotragus, and then this goes through the midline of the face. And there is a little mouthpiece, I don't have one handy, that goes right here, and that indexes against the maxillary arch. So you do this with some bite registration paste, and then that little removable plate would just come off and you would send that to the lab. So now they can even mount it up in the right position on an articulator. So incredibly useful tool here. So we're all done with this. We can take out the bite. You could take your model of your upper that you've done an alginate of, and then finally you could take this out, and everything stays nice and clean because you've not allowed any material to get down inside of those multi-units. The Teflon tape should peel away cleanly. There we go. So now imagine you can take your master impression that they've poured up, and you can now index it back into this, because it's going to have multi-units that are exactly like what you see right here. So when that model goes in, it's going to index perfectly. Now I do oftentimes take a burr and I will relieve a lot of this soft tissue, because it's hard to know if you've done the same level of tissue compression all through here. So I'll take the borders way back, I'll take the soft tissue registration back. I'm really just relying on those multi-units to position this, because that's the one thing I know for certain is going to be consistent from this model over to our verified master impression. So that's basically it. In one appointment, you'll be able to achieve master verified impression, allowing you to skip the verification jig, as well as vertical dimension records in a single appointment. So really you're condensing 3 appointments into one here, and the next step you can get back a try-in to try in against your upper, and if all is good with that, the next step would be delivery. So that's a big step to be able to minimize the number of appointments on this full arch stuff.